Okay. Great. So let me know when you're live and then we
You're
will.
live.
Okay, good morning, or good evening, good afternoon, or wherever you are. I welcome all of our observers as well through the YouTube channel. So we have one important item today. We will discuss our LCE project, and in particular, the final big remaining issue before we bring the LCE standard to vote at our September board meeting. This relates to the feedback we received on exposure draft of Part 10 audits of group financial statements. And we really need your advice, as the board members haven't heard the comments received on where the task force should go and presented a final standard for approval. All participants, as usual, have received our agenda papers for the video conference, and the notice of this meeting has been posted on our website. We have a full complement of board members at this meeting, and we have from official observers as well, from the PIOB, Michael Hafman, and from the CAG, Jim Dowkin, and from the Japan FSA, Yoshi Matsumoto. So it's great to have everyone with us today on what will promise to be one of the warmest days in Washington, D.C. in recent years. Thankfully, it's early and the air conditioning's going in my home office right now. A couple of notes. Today is LCE day, and I would be derelict if I didn't acknowledge that this is, as a staff member, Amy's last board meeting. Amy Fairchild has been a key engine of this project from its start. She's worked on this and all of our disruptive technology initiatives, really helped us advance our social media channels and our handbook. And obviously, we will miss Amy very much. The good thing is that we will be able to celebrate her accomplishments in September during the board meeting, and the best way to celebrate it would be this approval of this standard. I should say that it is Sally Ann Bailey's last meeting as a staff member as well. I'm hopeful that we will get to celebrate all of her accomplishments too in September, but I'll have much more to say on Sally Ann at the September board meeting too. And, we celebrated Michael Hafman's role at as a PIOB observer, because it was the last meeting in person when we met in June, but this is his last meeting as an observer in the virtual environment. So we have a really good issues paper that's clearly spells out the feedback we received and the task force's advice. And I think with that, I should turn it over to Kai, who will help navigate us up this mountain still. We're almost to the top, Kai, I think.
Thank you, Tom. I am at my cabin, so I'm looking at the mountain right now, and I can say it's not one of the warmest days here. So we should have a mix of the weather in Washington and here, and then it would be okay, I think. Thanks for the intro, Tom. As you said, this is the first time we're bringing back the feedback from the group ED of ISA for LC. The task force has also updated the drafting, as you've seen in the issues paper, and updated draft. So we'll be discussing what the task force has done and whether we responded to you agree with the direction that we've taken after the comments received on the ED. Similar to previous times, Jasper and Amy will also participate and do parts of the presentation. So you'll hear more from them as we go. So if you flip to the next slide, Michelle. You saw the comment period, it closed in May this year. We did not get as much feedback on this as we did on the main standard. We got 60 comment letters. That being said, that was, I think, also a little bit more as expected, as a lot of the letters on the main standard did include some comments around groups, and this is more just how we implemented it in the standard and where we drew the line, as we have a lot of discussion in the board as well around which group audits are allowed to be in the standard or not. 60 letters, it did cover a good spread of stakeholders, as you saw from the issues paper, and also good geographical spread. So I think we have good feedback and representative from what we need. We have analyzed the comments for this presentation and the issues paper. You see that we've split it into 3 parts. One is relating to the prohibition to use component auditors. The second one is around the group-specific quantitative characteristics. So the first 2 ones is around the authority, and then the last part will be relating to the content of part 10 and the conforming amendments. So you've seen the feedback in the issues paper and how we set it up, also in agenda item 1A, where we updated A and B, I guess. A being the track changes, the marked version, and the B being the clear one, where we have where you see the updated drafting based on what we heard. So if you flip to the next slide, Michelle, this shows the spread feedback we got on the prohibition relating to the use of component auditors. You as a board remember we had long discussions on where do we draw the line on groups to be included. We did draw a line around no component auditors, with the exception of where physical presence is needed. There was, as I said, mixed feedback. Some supported the provision with some additional calls for explanatory material. Some wanted to expand the exemption so that there are additional component auditors could be used. Some wanted to narrow it. Some disagreed with the prohibition that they wanted. They said it's not a proxy for complexity. It's not focused around the complexity of the entity. It's around how you do the audit. It could limit adoption, add complexity decision making. And there were some additional calls for clarification and or guidance around how do you define component auditors and examples of situations that would fall in and out of the standard. I think a lot of these arguments we did discuss as a board prior to releasing the ED. The task force has gone through all of them, and as you see in the paper, we have how we've plan to address them. And as you see, we have not changed the prohibition specifically. We have provided additional guidance in the proposed standard, and also proposing supplemental guide on how types of groups that would be in situations that could be in the standard and would be out of the standard. The one area we did suggest a change or addition in the EM is in the EM under paragraph A1. When we released the ED, we thought it was not the component. We added more guidance around the component auditors, and we also had the discussion whether we needed to say group auditor or just auditor, as it wouldn't be you would have that different situation. Based on the feedback, we have now added back the content to say that it's group auditor versus engagement, single engagement. So to make that distinction more clear, that's one change that has been done throughout the standard to clarify based on those. I think with that, we can flip to the next slide, and we can get the board's views on the proposed way forward, not to make changes to prohibition, and also the revision to the EM. I think we can take those two together, Tom. So back to you for the board's feedback.
Thank you, Ty. I feel like this is a little bit like the Goldilocks solution that we're seeking here. Bed's too hard, the bed's too soft, the bed's just right. So it really want to hear from the board to hear how you respond to the disparate comments here. Again, I think our strategy all along is to be dealing with the greatest majority of circumstances of the typical LCE in a way that will assure our best chance for adoption throughout the world. And so this really is sort of a constrained optimization exercise here. And I think that's sort of, if I read the task force's comments, what the calculation you made in reaching your conclusion. Fernando.
Thank you, Tom and Guy. And I think this is really the tough question out of all the ED, and where we also heard a lot of discussion and feedback. Mixed views, consistent, I guess, with the outcome of the results that you were presenting. A large group wanted to expand and include component auditors, other on the contrary, just not to mention even the word component auditor. But at the end, I think the agreement that at least in my region was proposed is to keep it the way you have it. I think we agree also with the suggestions to the little changes that you're proposing. And the exemption, I guess, helps to balance what we typically see in LCE. It's not going to be perfect, but I guess it also provides some assistance when we have to use that those component auditors in a certain matter, not as full as we typically use them, but I think they were positive in at least keeping that balance.
Thank you. Diane.
Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear us well. We're in a conference room, but we're all trying to dial in separately. But first of all, thanks very much for the summary. I agree with Fernando. I mean, obviously, you've got a lot of different views. It's hard to please everybody. I am comfortable with the direction that you've taken. The one thought that I have, and this is just an idea, and this might help to pacify some folks, is, and it's going to sound very foundational, but it gets back to what is a component auditor versus a member of the engagement team. And there might be an opportunity to just make a distinction around when that person or persons are doing some work for you. I'll focus this specifically on who reviews the work that they're doing. I've always taken the approach, if the work is done by a local person, if I'm having somebody in Portugal, as an example, observe an inventory, and that work is performed and reviewed by a Portuguese team, and they're submitting it back to the group, that's purely a component auditor. If I've just outsourced, so to speak, the observation of that inventory to a staff member in Portugal, but those work papers somehow come back to the group, is that different? And is there an opportunity to just clarify that a bit? That again may pacify some of the folks who had different opinions, but net, I'm comfortable with where you went. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks. And probably consistent with what others have already said, the ongoing mixed feedback, and I think that that where we are landing is responsive to that. In the outreach I did before this call, there were questions raised about the addition that we've got in A1 by adding in documents and records, and I think that plays into what Diane's just said, because it's where does the line come between when an auditor is a component auditor, or whether it's simply somebody performing agreed upon procedures for the group auditor. And the request I had was for more explanatory material to maybe explain where that line might be drawn, or the other option I would say would be to revert back to what we had previously. So something to consider there. I think it's simply about drawing this line as to when somebody is in or out. Thanks.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. And like others, I believe the task force has appropriately considered all the responses that have come back and the very diverse views that have been received. I did observe that some responses seem to be just saying, let's get this done. Don't necessarily think you've got the right answer, but it's good enough for me, so let's move on, which is not really the best solution. And certainly, as others have mentioned this morning, this whole issue of component auditor versus member of the engagement team is one that keeps coming up in the outreach that I've had. And I guess it reflects on the opportunity that was missed when CAS 600, when ISA 600 was issued, to issue some good first implementation guidance around questions like that, and to now leave that to the LCE task force to develop guidance is a bit worrying for me. But that being said, I think it is important that some work be done around that, because I think that is an area where a lot of the questions are arising. One of the things I wanted to somewhat take issue with was in paragraph 18A, where it talks about the responses that came back indicating that the prohibition may unfairly impact certain SMPs. And I found I didn't really agree with the response that the task force had there, which was basically, this is not relevant. Because think of the situation where you've got two identical, less complex entity groups, and one is audited by a very small audit firm and another is audited by a much larger firm. And the point that's trying to be made here, I believe, is that in the SMP world, their only option to do that kind of audit might be to use a component auditor, whereas the larger firm may not need to use a component auditor because they can easily staff all the work within their office. And so I think that was the point that was trying to be made here. And I think that's really not been addressed in the task force comments on that. The last point I would like to make is really around there were some changes later on around the definitions. And one of the things that I was going to suggest that the task force consider is whether more should be put in around what the consolidation process is, because that the consolidation process under 600 has changed from what it was before, and I think it might need to be explained in the standard itself. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Vili?
Thank you, Tom. I just wanted to come in. We've heard a few comments now about the sort of when is the auditor in or out in terms of a component auditor. And I know there's a few people from the ISA 600 or the old ISA 600 task force on the call as well. So please come in if I'm getting this completely wrong. But I think what we need to realize, and that's how I've always understood ISA 600 setting it up, is that as soon as you have a group audit, as soon as you have audit of group financial statements, you will have a group auditor, and you may also have component auditors. And that's it. That's all you can have. You can either have group auditor and component auditors, nothing else. And a component auditor is part of the engagement team. There's no doubt about that. And I think the same principle applies here. There's nothing else. there is that additional guidance that says if you in an audit other than a group audit, you could use some of this material to help you. And that was in 600, sort of that notion of an other auditor. But you don't have an other auditor in a group audit. You can only have a group auditor and maybe component auditors, and that's it. So there shouldn't be any doubt that the component auditor is always part of the engagement team.
Yeah, on that
was
point,
We also added in, as you see in the blue box below A1, to try to address that issue that whether it's a network firm or not is irrelevant. As Willie explained, it's the same situation. So whether you're an SMP or a large firm, it doesn't really matter at all. It would follow the same rules. Either they'll be on the group engagement team or it's a component auditor.
Josephine?
Thank you. Yes, can you hear me okay?
Sound quality is pretty bad.
Okay, I'll try and just be really loud. I just like to say thank you to Kai and the team for this work. Like others, I agree with the Council's view, and I also appreciate the changes. But just wanted to say, similar to Sue, I was slightly concerned about the introduction of documents and records there. I wasn't necessarily convinced by those who suggested that should be included, that they were valid arguments, particularly where it comes to arguments that suggest there's some complexity, which takes us back into a complex environment again. So I would support the idea of actually reverting back to what we had previously. And also thanks to Billy, yeah, you're spot on your description of when in and when out of the group order. Thank you.
Okay, it was really difficult to hear that, but what I thought I heard, and I'm just trying to say this, and someone correct me if they heard differently, is that you agreed with Sue and you'd like to revert to original language, and you just want to emphasize your support for what Billy said. Is that correct? Yeah, I got it a thumbs up there. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Kai, for the presentation of the summary of the responses which the task force has got. Thanks very much for this. My comment to the question one is that I'm afraid that I do not agree with the proposed prohibition on the use of the proposed ISA for SE for group audits where component auditors are involved, and in particular to the limited circumstances where physical presence is required. There are many circumstances in which small and mid-sized audit firms use component auditors in other locations to perform audit work on components in other locations within a country where for expertise, convenience, or other reasons. Furthermore, within Europe, in which countries are often geographically smaller, and there are many cross-border businesses, there may be jurisdictional differences requiring local expertise, for example, local law, tax or business practices, or differences in official languages. And it is not uncommon for small and mid-sized firms to use component auditors for their local expertise or other convenience reason. Often such components may relate to very simple subsidiaries or branches reflecting simple production, sales, or other operations. So in my view, it would be disproportionate to claim that such audits are so complex that the ICE standard cannot be used simply because of the fact that the financial statements constitute group financial statements as defined in ISA 600 revised, and component auditors are used. I would like to add to prohibiting the use of component auditors in this way, will likely, in addition to other matters, lead, in my view, to the use of national standards rather than IAASB standard for audits of LCEs in some jurisdictions. Thanks. That's all. Back to you, Tom. Thanks.
So, Kai, again, this is a comment that you made at the when we approved Part 10. I have not seen, this was a fundamental comment about the construct. Noted for the record, I don't believe we've heard anyone else taking that point of view or changing their point of view as a result of the comment. But it's noted. If others have a similar point of view, please note it. But again, I think our board attitude up till this point was, you know, that some jurisdictions may not adopt it because of this prohibition. But our attitude has been as a board that expanding the use beyond what we have today would also lead to circumstances where the standard would not be used and could have other deleterious effects on the whole suite of ISAs for LCEs and our standards as well. So I just wanted to set that up. Right, your objection is noted for the record, and it's similar to what you've stated in the past.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everybody. Thank you, Kai and team. I think an outstanding job. This has been quite a journey, and there have been a lot of mixed views, but I think the task force has landed in the right place, so the bet is just right for me. And also appreciate the addition to the EEM as presented. I will say I'm not troubled by documents and records. I'm also not troubled, including Billy's comment with respect to the definitions in ISA 600. But at the same time, as I'm listening to all these comments about ISA 600 and implementation guidance, which I agree with Eric, is needed as it relates to ISA 600, this standard needs to stand on its own, which was a big journey for me as a lifelong auditor. So when I look at this, when I look at where we landed and the standard alone, I think we've got it just right at this point. So that's all I wanted to add.
To be clear, though, unless we receive a lot of new injection of resources and consider the state of play of 600, there is no plans in the near future to do guidance on 600. But I do take Wendy's most important point is that the standard is going to stand on its own. Neil?
Thank you, Tom. Kai, thank you to the task force. Overall, I certainly agree with it. So the changes that you've made, we do note that there are limited concerns, well, there's some concerns around the limited use of component auditors could create a loophole and use them more often than what was intended. I mean, thoughts around that is, one, I think the qualitative characteristics that we already have in the LCE would be a backstop to prevent some of that. We also see the requirements in relation to engagement quality is going to prevail regardless. So those are two elements that I think are useful in preventing the over usage when we've allowed this limited set of circumstances. One thing I've noted is in the blue box at the bottom, you've got a paragraph that begins with part 3, and it makes reference then into engagement quality. It may end up being some redundant wording given the definition that Billy emphasized, but I think there's just an opportunity in that paragraph to also include component auditors. Now, I know that's the same as the engagement team, and it's in that sentence where it says contains relevant requirements in relation to engagement quality, including relevant ethical requirements and the direction and supervision of the members of the engagement team, including the component auditors. and a review of their work. And that perhaps will just emphasize the need for the group auditor to be involved in that work as intended by the standards. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Isabel.
Hello, everybody, and thanks to the task force. I am in the camp of that's good enough for me. Even if I agree, it's not the ideal way to define when you're in or you're out, but at least that's the best one we could find. And we needed to draw a line, so at least it's a clear one. I agree it may exclude some practitioners from applying the standard, but we have to keep in mind that currently nobody is applying this standard because it's not yet in force. So when it will be finalized, it will be able to be applied by many practitioners, even if some will not be able to use it. But still public interest to finalize it as it is. I agree that ideally it would have been great to better define what is a component auditor. Because we have never said if you are the partner in one office and you're using the staff of another office, are you using a component auditor or not? If you're using another office of the same firm in the same country, is it a component auditor or not? We have never clarified that, and there's no way we can do it in this standard without modifying 600. And modification of 600 was not in the scope of this project. So I'm in the camp of that's good enough for me, and I support what has been done by the task force. Thank you.
Thank you. Warren?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Isabel. I'm also in the that's good enough for me camp on this particular set of prohibitions, and I like that very succinct way of putting it. Kai, I have great empathy for you on this particular project because I think it's a case of damned if you do and damned if you don't. I do understand the logic behind the prohibition. It's not something that I'm going to push back on particularly hard. I also empathize with if we get too many lines, it may lead to inadvertently the standard in different jurisdictions. As a suggestion only, something that has come out of the research and the interaction we've been doing here on our side of the pond is to consider the sort of the concept of the component auditor and introduce some type of rebuttable presumption, or otherwise to take the component auditor and use it as an illustration of how those qualitative characteristics could be triggered in trying to delineate between whether you're in or not in. But I just want to iterate that that is only a suggestion from the outreach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Warren. So there seems to be general support for the approach that the task force has given. There is a little bit of a need for some clarity regarding the documents and records issue. So Kai, I'm going to turn it over to you and see if you want to frame something up for us to consider.
Yeah, I think adding documents and records in the parentheses in A1, A3, I guess, no, A1, was trying to address some of what we heard as a responses to the other situations where physical presence could be needed. So that's the reason for adding them. But we heard a few board members that would like to revert back to the original wording. So whether we could get some clarity whether those words should be in or out. I think at the same time, I can just address the comments we heard so far as well. I think as the last one said, the last couple of commentators said it's good enough for now, or good to go out. And damned if you do and damned if you don't, I think is a good summary. So the clarity and the discussion that we were having now is mostly around the definition of component auditor, as we have in 600. And I think we as a task force had lots of discussion around this and had really difficulties trying to come up with something more clear, not altering or fiddling with the 600. So this is where we are trying to add some, there are some more in the supplemental guide to help on this, and also situations or examples, I think, is something that we could have discussed that we could provide to help the issue. But I think we need some clarity around whether documents or records should be in A1D II, or whether it should go out. So if we can get the board members' input on those.
Okay, let's see if we could do this simply, and we'll see where the board splits by use of your digital hands. So the raise hand function. Who supports the inclusion of documents or records? So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I got a thumbs up as well. I think we could, anyone believe it's a fatal flaw? Remove your hands. Greg, do you believe it's Josephine? Would you like to come in?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so if you look at the letters to this particular point, there was, other than there was one which was a Hong Kong scenario, which we've already established would be most definitely additional complexity. I don't see how any other matters justify an additional extension, and that, I believe, could inadvertently be misunderstood to mean inspection of documents as part of risk assessment procedures or further audit procedures. And so from that perspective, I think we're moving into actual component auditor work as you direct and supervise them in the risk assessment process or in the further audit procedures of the audit. So the physical inspection doesn't really mean very much. And so, as I say, the other examples were, well, there's a foreign language. Well, surely that might actually be some of the part of the engagement team that can do that. So I can't justify extending it beyond what we already have from my perspective. So
Okay, I'm going to try to interpret what I felt was really hard to hear. Your concern relates to the potential misinterpretation of documents and records, really extending what we think is a very narrow scope, effectively exception, to something that entails the general work of what we would think of component auditors in a group audit situation. And that's why you're concerned about it. You're nodding your head. Okay. My interpretive skills are getting better as the morning goes on. Edda?
Yes, thank you, Tom, and hello, everybody. I think I'm a little bit softer than Josephine on this, but still leaning that direction. As I have no problem with somebody physically inspecting a record or some documentation that is in that specific territory. So if it's meant in the literal sense of physical inspection of that document, I'm okay with it. But if there's the notion, and that is the danger of the way it's been worded here, that, well, we're doing work around records or documents, then that goes too far. And that's the bright line. I think you summarized it well, Tom. If we can use words to sort of clarify, that's what we mean. And which is one of the reasons why I didn't raise my hand on your first question, because I still think this could be interpreted the wrong way. Thank you.
So I wonder if we're going to keep this in, that we could, over the next month, work to say that this is really about the narrow physical inspection of the document and records, not about broad component auditor work. Sue?
Yeah, so I think Ado summarised that really well. My initial suggestion was to add more explanatory material to explain when it was appropriate. So I support what you've just summarised in terms of a way forward.
Yeah, you know, Kai, I gotta turn it back to you. Like, my guess is if we can't make it very clear that this is a really narrow outlet here, maybe we should consider removing it, but drafted on the fly at this board meeting probably is not the most productive use of time. I think you get the sense of no general gist of both the objections and why people would want it in. I don't know if you have any particular reaction.
No, nothing other than say that Ido's interpretation was what we intended to have in. So whether there is a way that we can clarify the wording or not, we as a task force can discuss that and come back with it. But then, Josephine, you're also okay with if we're able to make it clear that it's about physical inspection of documents and records and not, okay, yeah, I see you nodding. So then we'll see how we can try to address that.
Okay. That's great. Shall we move on to the next section?
Yeah, we can do that. I'll then hand over to Amy, I think, to do the qualitative characteristics.
Thanks, Kai. So as Kai just mentioned, we're going to move on to question 2, which was around qualitative characteristics. We did see general support for the group specific qualitative characteristics that were proposed to be included in the authority. The most significant area of feedback related to the use of numerical indicators in the qualitative characteristics. So the number of entities or business units or the number of jurisdictions that entities or business units are in, with some respondents being concerned that they may be seen as defined rules rather than examples, particularly by regulators. Taking into account the previous conversations regarding the purpose of adding the numerical indicators into the main authority, so this is really to respond to the overarching comment from the original exposure draft that the authority should be more specific and clear about what we mean as a typical LCE. The task force have proposed to keep the characteristics, the numerical indicators and the characteristics, but to add an additional sentence in as lead-in just to make it clearer what their purpose is and that they're not intended to be definitive. The second key area of feedback related to the characteristics, describing the number of jurisdictions, with respondents noting that complexity isn't necessarily linked to the number of jurisdictions, but rather the key differences between them. So we updated the characteristics to be clearer on the type of things that would actually bring the complexity based on the examples and the comments that we received from respondents. And finally, the task force responded to specific feedback on the bullet points describing what a simple consolidation process was. So we changed changing to similar rather than the same for accounting policies, and removing the bullet on sub-consolidations as was causing confusion. There could be many reasons why you could have very simple sub-consolidations. And the task force felt that it was already addressed by the other points in the list regarding, whether adjustments were complex or not. So they were the big things I wanted to point out to you. So I think with that, we can move on to feedback on question 2. So I'll hand over to you, Tom.
Many thanks, Amy. Okay, question 2. Hi.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for the presentation. I support some of the changes that have been made, including that only similar rather than the same accounting policies are not considered complex, that reference has been made to common economic zones as part of the group structure and activities, which is helpful in an EU environment, and that the restriction on sub-consolidations has been removed. Thanks for this. However, I continue to have a number of concerns, in particular requiring a centralized finance function for components when such components may be in different jurisdictions within the same economic zone, and decentralization may be needed for legal or tax reasons. I suggest that decentralized finance function do not necessarily lead to greater complexity, and in fact, in some cases may lead to less complexity. This could mean that the total finance function, including that of components, would be greater than 5 individuals. I also believe that because slightly different reporting periods, for example, difference of 1 quarter, may be used for tax accounting reasons, does not automatically lead to a complex group audit. In addition, I believe that the reference to few in a number of instances is overdone. A few generally means no more than 4, whereas using the words no more than several permits greater flexibility. That's all from my side. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. And sorry, Kai, I just have to react to what you just said, and I think I entirely disagree with everything you said. So that's the I'm in entirely the opposite camp, and as it comes to my my own observations, I saw the group structure and activity change. I actually preferred 3 or less because I think it illustrated what we had in mind. I can live with the qualitative criteria, so not so that's acceptable to me. But I did have questions about what we mean with a common economic zone. Kai mentioned the EU. Well, that is considered by some as an economic zone. But if I compare Holland with Hungary, there is no way that those are comparable. So if the EU is used as an economic zone, it's the wrong example. I've went through the respondents' comments, and none of the respondents asked for the common economic zone, or at least I couldn't find it. So I would suggest to strike the in a common economic zone from that sentence, and then I can live with it. I had another question about the consolidation process. I appreciate we moved from the same to similar. I think similar is too weak. The words I would be coming up with would be practically the same, or at very least consistent, but similar leaves too much flexibility in it for my taste. Thank you very much.
And on that last point, on your first point about common economic zone, it would be true to say within a common economic zone, particularly, for example, the European Union, that it does have virtually the same characteristics as laws and regulations, business practice. Like, I mean, you don't need it. The same would be true is that in the common market, there are common economic rules that apply. So your point is that you may be extending it in a way that's unnecessary and may cause confusion, right?
Yes, and yes, because that would be because people would be leaning on the common economic zone with disregard to laws and regulations that are different or business practices that are different. That within the EU there are quite significant differences between certain territories.
I got it. Josephine.
Thank you. Try again. On the my very first point is that I completely support Ado's view entirely with respect to the reference to the common economic zone. I would also like to suggest that we strike that as well. I have a different perspective on the addition to A3 on the qualitative characteristics. We did say that those were important for our stakeholders to understand why we as a board have come to the conclusions with regard to the requirements and the explanatory material and what we believe to be an LCE typically. The introduction to A3 already says The list is not exhaustive nor intended to be absolute, and other relevant matters may also need to be considered. I think then saying numerical indicators have been provided as examples is not necessarily strictly correct in terms of what we were trying to use them for, and I think it undermines the qualitative characteristics generally. So I would like to see that struck, and hopefully you've got all of that. Thank you.
Eric.
Thanks, Tom. Generally supportive of the changes that have been made here. I have the same concern as others about common economic zone, and I think we can live without it. But that's the only thing I really wanted to emphasize. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sue?
Thank you. So I took myself down a bit of a rabbit hole in the adjustment or the change in referring to similar accounting policies, because I was thinking you could have accounting policies actually that were quite different, but the consolidation adjustments were very simple. And as I was reflecting on that, I was thinking that actually the first two bullets in that list are probably examples of where the consolidation adjustments are simple. So my suggestion actually would be to take the third bullet to the top, because I think that's the indicator of complexity, is if the consolidation is straightforward, and then things like similar accounting policies are okay, and I then sort of understand why that works. I also had a couple of pieces of feedback in relation to the quantitative thresholds, and just the way in which that's expressed, and whether we would be clarifying that whether the auditor would be expected to document the rationale if there were, let's say there were four components or what have you. So I think the explanation there, it would be helpful to build out a little bit more, and I'll send some comments in offline. Thanks.
Fernando?
Thank you, Tom. And we're also in favor of the proposed changes. I think there's an overwhelming agreement in the responses, and the what the task force is proposing, I think, accommodates flexibility for different facts and circumstances without really losing the whole picture of having an LCE engagement. Thanks.
Thank you. Neil?
Thank you, Tom. So I need to try and find us a middle ground here. So as I read it, we obviously list out several qualitative characteristics that need to be considered to determine whether the ISA for LCE and group audit is appropriate. Now, it's clear that you may have one or more of these characteristics, but that still concludes that the LCE is appropriate under those circumstances. Now, what we've ended up doing is we've removed the guidance in relation to those complexities. And so you are left in a position where if you have one of those complexities, it's still appropriate to use LCE, but you're left without guidance on how to deal with it. So for example, if we talk about having a different financial reporting period, so you conclude that it's okay, but now there's no guidance on how to deal with the different financial reporting period. I don't want all the requirements in, and I don't want to refer to the ISAs. So it's kind of like landing a sentence in that guidance which says, to the extent that qualitative characteristics are present, but it's determined that the ISA for LCE is appropriate in the circumstances, the auditor's got to use their judgment in addressing those complexities relating to those characteristics. And that's about as good as I can get you, but I felt that some additional guidance as to what they needed to do to address that single complexity would be needed. In addition, I think a couple of examples in relation to access to informational people and the consolidation process, and I'll provide those back in some offline comments.
Okay, Wendy?
Thanks, Tom. I think in this journey, there's been a lot of strong opinions on both sides. I was quite content on where we landed from a balance and a flexibility perspective, as well as from a principles-based perspective. Just to remind everybody, I didn't want any numbers. I thought it was too restrictive, and it, wouldn't allow for the judgment needed. But I think the words as written allow you to get there. I'm sensitive to what Josephine said about the first sentence being adequate, but I want to emphasize that I do like the second sentence. I thought it really helped in my case to say that, they're just numbers and you have to consider it in your jurisdiction and use your judgment. The new point that was brought up about the common economic zone, I wasn't too sensitive to that, but I would be fine if it came out. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Diane?
So maybe not the first time this has been said. I have a slightly different view. I love numbers. I can live with the changes that you made to the group structuring activities, pulling out my 3 or less because you left the 5 or less up above. Not crazy about common economic zone either, but I can live with it, net. And then I'm completely with Josephine in 8.3. That second sentence, I feel like is a step backwards. I mean, we've already said it's not exhaustive. We've already put a caveat. This is like a second caveat. So I just think it's really unnecessary and unfortunately takes a step back. I think I've been fairly vocal about that. I really thought it was important to provide context as to what we thought were the appropriate instruments that would use this standard. And so I'm still staying true to that. Thanks.
Isabel?
Yeah, I did not realize that common economic zone could deal with the EU. I had in mind some economic zone that exists in French-speaking Africa. Not only they have a common economic zone and a common currency, but they also share the same accounting principle and the same business law and labor law and contract law. So thinking at that, I was thinking it was appropriate. If it's an economic zone that has different rules and law country per country, I agree it could be challenging.
Okay. Let me try to summarize. Like, there's a lot of focus on this new sentence in 8.3. I don't know. I guess now that I look at it, it looks a little redundant too. I don't know why you couldn't just say the list is illustrative and not exhaustive nor intended, like just add the word is illustrative in the second sentence rather than having a new sentence, but that's something for the task force to consider. This economic zone element, I wonder whether it's causing more confusion than necessary, Kai, and people are focusing on it, but I feel like the first part of the sentence may get you there anyway with some adjustments. But I return it back to you for consideration. I take Kai Ue's comments as more fundamental, and again, as I said before, it reflects some of his concerns that have been stated throughout the project, but I don't believe anyone else shared similar fundamental concerns. Kai?
Tom,
Amy?
yeah, I can jump in first.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, if there's anything else you want to add on top, Kai, I mean, I think there's been some pretty good comments in from the board members. I think we can go away as a task force and relook at the economic zone. It was really to try and react to some of the examples provided, in terms of geographical regions by respondents. But taking on board, I think what the board members have said today, I think we can go back and look at that. With regard to the numerical indicators, we got a pretty strong messaging from respondents, which is why we felt that we needed to do something in this area. We can go back and kind of look at the drafting, and maybe a solution is something similar to what you proposed, Tom. So and just trying to be clearer that they're illustrative without having to add a whole new sentence in. And I know there is mixed views on the board regarding that, what we've added in as well. So we'll go back and talk as a task force about that. And then the consolidation process, some good comments there and some suggestions on how we can deal with that. So I think from my point of view, there's a couple of things that we can obviously take back and talk about. Kai, I don't know if there's anything specific you want to raise based on what people have.
No, I think you picked up the three issues that came up. The numerical indicator was one, as we all task force go back and see how we can soften. But as you said, it was a quite strong message from a lot of people saying around that, and then also the common economic zone we'll look at, and then very thankful to get Neil's suggested wording on some of these issues, as he said as well. So thank you.
Okay, anyone else want to come in on this section? Okay, Kai, I don't know who's presented the third part.
I'll pass the hot potato over to Jasper so that he can handle it now. So Jasper, on to you.
Thank you, Kai. So I'm like question 3 is really for the proposed revisions to part 10 and related conforming amendments. I think in general there was a lot of support what we had in part 10. We're a limited number of suggestions that we received, and the suggestions that we received is mainly aligning it with 600 revised. And also some alignment and duplication that was noted with the other parts, so part 1 to 9. So going through the main change, the other thing I think comment that came through a lot was on component auditors. They wanted guidance, the respondents who would like to have component auditors, they of course wanted component auditors in the requirements and application material, or EEM. So we haven't done that given on where we went with the direction, but that was some of the feedback that we heard. So on the main change that we've made is 10.4.1. We made several changes. We first clarified that the auditor needs to obtain an understanding of the operations and IT systems, as it was by several respondents suggesting to add something around that. Then, given the change to the qualitative factors and the change from same to similar, and whether we change that wording further, that we'll have to see. But I still think it's anyway useful to add that the auditor needs to obtain an understanding of the financial reporting framework, because they're not exactly the same anymore. So that's been added. Then to 10.4.1b and then Roman 4, we added here that the auditor needs to obtain an understanding of how group management communicates significant matters to the management of entities and business units. And this is partly added because of a comment that was made during the June board meeting. So for a non-group, less complex entities, it's kind of implicit on how these communications go. But once you're dealing with business units and entities in different locations, it might not be that implicit anymore. So that's why we added this requirement in here. Then respondents noted that 10.7.1 was redundant because it's covered by 1.8.6 in part 1. So that's why the task force deleted this requirement. And then lastly, on 10.8. We added key elements of the understanding of the group's entities, a group's system of internal control to be documented. This is in line with 600 revised, which also requires the documentation of the group's system of internal control. And given that there are also requirements in 10.4 around that, we thought it would be good to add. And then one last thing on the glossary. That's where we added the definition of group auditor that Willy mentioned before as well. So with that, Tom, I'm going to hand it over to you again.
Thank you. So we're going to take comments on the draft in part 10 now. Kai?
Thanks, Tom. Very briefly, with the exception of having no requirements for component auditors for the reasons I noted previously, I'm satisfied with the proposed revisions to Part 10 and the conforming amendments. That's all. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. Also satisfied with most of the revisions. Just a couple of points. The change that was made to 10.2.1, where they've added in that additional sentence, it's kind of in the middle of a sentence that came from paragraph A52 of 600, and so it's kind of split up a bullet that came from another standard, and I just wondered whether it would be easier to read if the sentence was split out from the sentence that was taken from the bullet, just to make it clearer. And secondly, I just had one question for the task force to consider. In 10.7.2, I understand and acknowledge the removal of 10.7.1, but wondered also about 10.7.2b for the same reasons, because it looks like it's a repetition of what's in paragraph 1.8.6, so you might want to have a look at that. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Wendy?
Keep thinking my hand will go down. Sorry. Thank you, Tom. Supportive of the changes. Just carrying on one minor point that carry on to what Eric said. I agree with the deletion of 10.7.1. And looking at 10.7.2b very quickly, I could live with that deletion as well. But I did think in 1.8.6, we should consider either EEM or stating that it also relates to a group audit. So just for the task force to consider once we delete it in this section. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
So I was happy with what's in here, but I had a couple of questions about areas that the task force has decided not to take action on. This section is designed to stand on its own, and there were comments in the issues paper that other parts of the standard address certain points, and therefore they've not been addressed within the group section. But I felt that some of those requirements are quite important, and whether a prompt would be needed either in the other section, which is probably not ideal, or here. And the kinds of examples I've got are things like the documentation requirement on the use of a component auditor. The objective is different to what we have in 600, and so whether there are parts there that are needed. You won't be surprised, given my comments on 600, that I don't necessarily agree with the views on materiality and equity method investments. Entities such as property groups are less complex entities, and they do quite commonly have equity accounted investments. But that said, there's only one reference to equity investments, and that's actually in the definition of consolidation. So it's a kind of consistency point there, really, which is, do we need to even say anything about it if we're then omitting it from any requirements? And then finally, I just thought that it's a little bit confusing to have in section 10 that references are to the auditor are to the group auditor, but then in the authority we don't reference group auditor at all, and so I think there's just a bit of consistency there to help smooth that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. Josephine?
Thank you. Just something Amy asked me to go back and look at. In your change to 10.4.1, it's not quite aligned with ISO 600 in the sense that understanding the extent to which the IT systems are similar is obviously not the language used in 600, and you may be kind of consolidating those three aspects that we do with commonality, controls, etc. So just double check that it's not actually gone beyond what we already have now in 600. And then the other thing to just check is your language. I think we only use information technology and not systems. So just go back and check that. So a couple of things. One, make sure you haven't actually gone beyond what's required in 600 by using terminology loosely. And then second, make sure that the terminology aligns with 315 and the rest of the LCE. Thank you.
Okay. I think I got that. It's about making sure that we're careful that the language is consistent with 600, if that's the idea, and not effectively extending the requirement unintentionally by some lack of precision in language. Is that right? Okay. Thank you. Jasper, so I see general support for what you've done in section 10, part 10. However, some suggestions related to language throughout, but nothing in my mind fundamental. But I'll turn it back to you for your reflections.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, and I'll just respond to a few of the comments made. Of course, we'll consider all of them. Maybe going first on 10.7.2b. So the reason why we kept this one in, because there were still reference to group management, component management. We thought it would be useful, and this is slightly different from what's on 1.8.6. It's just a little bit that additional thinking when you are dealing with a group. So that's why we kept it in. We can see whether we could make it work with 1.8.6, but then with some wording. But we don't, given the importance of fraud and suspected fraud, and the focus on it, we don't want to lose anything on that one in that area. So on the changes to the documentation requirements that Sue used, referred to on the use of component auditors, we don't have a similar requirement either in 600, and we thought it would be more burdensome to add that here. Plus, it's already included in documenting your when you're doing your audit strategy and the audit plan, which of course referred to just generally the planning the audit as we would refer to it in the ISO for LCE. On equity investments, we generally have the view that equity investments you won't have those in an and don't have any guidance on therefore on it in a less complex entity, and for reason is we think it's unlikely that that a lot of LCEs are with an equity investment. Plus, when you have an equity investment, there's a chance, or at least in 600 we saw that a lot of issues around there with restrictions on access to information and people. And once you have that, you're also anyway out of this standard. So I think we have to look back on the definition on consolidation and maybe take that out as a difference, but it would then be a difference with ISO 600 revised. Otherwise, we'll look at some of the wording and to make sure it's consistent. With Eric, your suggestions as well. I think with that, Kai, do you have anything you would like to emphasize?
I think you covered it all there, Jasper.
Okay, Kai, I think I'll turn it back to you for any other issues that you want to raise related to the LCE standard.
Thank you. I think, Michelle, if you go to the next slide, what is left is just saying what's the way forward. And as you know, in September, we'll have a discussion on the full draft of the standard, then including part 10 as also. So it's a full version of the draft, and that's where we have the vote on the standard. And we, at the same time, we, as a task force, will work on materials for adoption and implementation. In September, we'll also discuss the outstanding questions from the ED that we have not responded to yet, as effective date, early adoption, how to deal with future updates and maintenance, and support and guidance material needed when implementing standard. So that's the way forward. I think other than that is just thank the board for the input on the updated drafting on part 10 and the authority to it. And the task force will meet in 2-3 weeks time, or maybe a bit more, in Oslo to have our final meeting to prepare for the September board meeting. So Amy, Jasper, anything you want to add to that? No, I think then Tom, we're done from our side. So it was quick and efficient meeting from with the input from the board. Liz?
Well, one technical thing, under the new under our relationship with the PIOB, it's not just the expected approval, the due process. It's a broad certification of the public interest commitment and framework that goes into our standards. So I do think I should acknowledge that, which is a good segue to first invite Jim and then Michael to comment on the session. Jim?
Thanks, Tom. And just reflecting on some of the CAG discussion, previous discussion on LCE, I think if I were to summarize it, the CAG had mixed views, but I think where this is landed, I think I think you're in a good place. I think it represents a reasonable approach, and I think if I were to bring it back to the CAG for further discussion, they would be happy. We'll see where it ended up. So a good discussion to get today. I think good progress on where you're going.
Thank you, Jim. Michael?
Yes, thanks, Tom. Yeah, excellent discussion today. Lots of good points and good input provided by the board to the task force on the drafting. And I think that will be useful to help move this forward to its completion. Just one further thing to think about as the drafting goes forward, and more guidance is provided on some of these issues that were discussed today. It's just the placement of that guidance, whether it's within the standard itself or whether it's within the supplementary guidance on the authority. I guess my preference would be if there's a choice between the two, to put it in the standard itself so that it's there up front for those who are using it to see it, rather than in the supplemental guidance. But leave that for the task force to think about and the board to consider when it comes back to you in September. And thank you, Tom, also for clarifying the nature of the PIOB's review. I was going to raise that point as well. And so best of luck for moving this project on to completion. I think it will provide a real useful addition to this suite of standards that will be welcomed by many around the world.
Thank you, Michael, for your comments. Okay, any other remarks on LCE standard from the board? Well, I think we're in really strong position for approval in September. As you know, our next meeting in September will be on September 18th to the 21st, 4-day meeting, beginning on Monday and then in early afternoon on Thursday, with a roundtable on our ED 5000, which will be published on Tuesday of next week. The agenda of that meeting has been communicated now. And Veli, I think this would be a good moment if you want to share any reflections on our September agenda, please do.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, we posted the agenda last week, yesterday. And I think, you know, what you will see is no surprises. We always thought that ISA for LCE, we're going to go for approval. Fraud is going to come back for a second read in terms of laying the ground for approval in December. The one item that you may not have expected to see on the agenda, but during the June meeting, there was a lot of coordination in the background between myself and Sue and the Audit Evidence Task Force, is that we did feel that it was important to bring the audit evidence feedback that we received on the ED back to the board in September, because some of the feedback we heard on the audit evidence standard may be relevant in terms of programming decisions that we're going to take in terms of the strategy and work plan discussion. And that's why that item is there. It was originally slated to only come back in December, but we thought it was important to share that feedback already now, seeing that we are going to have the strategy and work plan discussion. And that's also why it's been sequenced on the agenda, that we'll have the firstly the audit evidence discussion, and then also the strategy and work plan discussion. And then the other point that I just wanted to highlight is just note on the Thursday morning, we will have a joint session with the ethics board. It will be at the IFAC offices. They are meeting in the same week, but their meeting is at the AICPA offices. But for that 2-hour session on the Thursday morning, we will meet in the boardroom, our normal boardroom at the IFAC offices. And the main focus of that joint session will be on the strategy and work plan. They've also finished their consultation on the strategy and work plan. So we will see if there's some joint up thinking and commonalities that we need to highlight on both sides in terms of both boards finalizing their strategies and work plans. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. In terms of, just to clarify, we haven't entirely figured out the exact format of the roundtables, but there should be an opportunity for broad participation from board members in the roundtable as well. And we'll be giving you some more information on that shortly. Any comments on September's agenda? Questions? That's also, okay, I see no questions. Please feel come back to me or Billy if you have comments or suggestions. In terms of December's meeting, similar 4-day format, beginning Monday, ending on Thursday, no later than 2 p.m. So I think we agreed to that as well at the last meeting. And so just wanted to highlight that too. A few other things is that the draft minutes of this meeting will be prepared shortly and be posted for approval at our September meeting. We'll have 2 sets of minutes included at a June meeting for approval at that time. Our next CAG meeting, or the last CAG in this iteration, will be on September 12th and 13th in New York. We'll let you know about the agenda and who's needed to join us, either virtually or in person shortly. And then finally, all I'm left to do is to thank the task force and the staff for the preparation of this meeting, and for all the board for your participation, and the TAs who've helped the board members prepare for the meeting. So thank you. And for all of our observers who are watching us on YouTube, thank you for joining us. Now, just one final thing, as I said, our ED on 5000 will be published on the 2nd of August, which is, I mistakenly said Tuesday. My sense of time, maybe because I'm traveling so much, is lost, but that's a Wednesday of next week. We are briefing a number of people in relation to that as well. We will hope you promote it, because the goal is to get maximum input into the process, and our outreach activities are well underway, as you know. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day, and congratulations to the task force. We are set to go for approval in September. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.